I've got some exciting projects for you, and these projects are some of the most commonly asked questions. So as a response to some of the most commonly asked for questions by students and how to set up some really cool mini projects using Google Apps Script. So first of all, we're going to be starting out with creating a multi-page web app in Apps Script. So with Apps Script and with web apps, typically it's designed to have just the one single page, but I'm going to show you how you can use Apps Script and use the parameters within the URL in order to set up a multi-page site where you can create and include style sheets, include your JavaScript code, separation of the files, and just a better way to organize your web app files in the Google Apps Script system. Next up is going to be an interactive document where we're going to be adding in custom functions to the UI, so making the document interactive where we can select and run certain functions go within the UI menu of the document. And this is also one of the most commonly asked for functions, is to make our docs, our sheets more interactive and what we can do with the UI. So this example is going to demonstrate some of the really nice functionality that you can incorporate into your document services. Next up is also going to be a custom web app. So this is going to be a quiz cut with questions coming from a spreadsheet and then generating a quiz that can be interacted with as a web app and sending the data back into the spreadsheet to be provided to the user within a web URL. So there's some advantages of doing it this way, where we can customize the headers within the sheet, as well as we can easily update the questions all within one spreadsheet, and they're going to automatically be dynamically shown to the users within the web app because the data is all coming from the one source. So all these three exciting projects are going to be available in this section. Let's get started. This lesson, we're going to be transforming the web app, and then this section, the next few lessons, we are going to be transforming a web app into a multi-page web app. And the benefit of this is that we can design the web pages as we typically would. We can move through multiple pages. Web apps are by default designed to be on one page, but you can also include additional files, have a dynamic menu. So if, for instance, we want to add another page to our web application and we also want to update some of the styling, we've made it really easy to do. So we're creating a brand new page. We just update the menu. We can create a new file out of it, and just using index4 as the name for this file. So this allows us an easy way to create a website, and if we want to include the menu, then we can include the menu as well, and it's fairly easy to do, where we just reference the function that we want to run. And now across all the pages, when we do a refresh, we're going to have our newly created page. We can go to that page and we've got the heading there, and then we've got the menu that's being generated. And we've also got style sheets that we're including as well. So we've created a function that we can include the style sheets into any one of the pages. So for instance, we want to reference style 1, we save it, and we want to bring the same style into this page, we can bring the style 1 into that page. And then in order to update the styling on our website, we only need to just go to the one page and it will have all of the styling. So now our background color is that teal blue, and if, for instance, we want to go to style 1 and we want to make some updates, so we want to make it less, so we want to make it more of a light color and update the font. We can do that really easily within the page and just referencing and updating the one file. If we want to update our navigation bar to look more like a real navigation bar, so updating the list style, and this is going to be regular CSS, so set the list style to be none. Let's update the margin of this to be 0, and padding we'll set to 0. So this way we can, and then overflow we'll set to hidden. So there's no overflow outside of the unordered list. And then let's take the list items that we have in the navigation menu, and we can float those to the left to create a float, and then take the list items with the anchor tags and update that to display block value, and add in some padding So do 5 pixels of padding, and then also update the background. And let's do the background color. So we can set that to be dark color and save. And now when we go back to the pages, now the navigation menus should be all changed across all of the pages, as long as we're bringing in the style 2 value. So it looks like the index 2 page is not importing the right style attribute, and that's correct, it's not sitting there. So we need to bring in the style sheet. So we can do that with the include and select the style sheet that we want to use. So we want to use style 1, and now we go back out to the page and we've fixed the navigation menu. So all of this is what we're going to be producing in the next 3 lessons: how you can create multiple pages, how you can include files, and then also how you can run functions that are sitting within the Google Script side of things within the web app pages. And then after completed, you can take the code and create your own version of this application. In this lesson, we're going to be creating the first part of our project, and the project is to develop a multi-page web app. So typically, web apps are designed to be one page, but using the parameters, you can create this as multiple pages. So we see we've got a default starting page, an index page, and within the parameters, we've got a parameter that we're looking for called page, and we can set and update the parameters. So if we select page index, that's going to actually return back the same one, because this is our default page that we're starting with. And we've got that set up within the web code. We also created a separate page, so index 2. So this is going to render out content, and not a whole lot of content here, but it's just going to render out a different template. We're tracking the event object content within the web page itself, so that we can get a better idea of the different parameters and the event object details. And as well, we're outputting it onto the page using document write. So this is all front end code. And if a page is requested that is not found, so let's say you're looking for contact page, we get a page not found 404 error. So all of this is what we're setting up in this lesson. This is going to be the first part of the web application that we're building. Let's go over to Google and select new project, and this is going to be a standalone script where we're going to be developing the web app, and it's eventually going to be a multi-page app. And apps are typically designed to be the single page running some content under the doGet function, but there are ways that you can create multiple pages and render out pages depending on what is within the parameters. So that's what we're going to be setting up. So let's create our first function, and this is going to be the doGet function. So that's the default trigger function. I'll make the screen slightly bigger so the code's a little bit easier to read. And we also want to pick up the event object, so the parameters that are passed within the URL string, and then we also want to make use of those. So within the doGet first, we're just going to generate and create our web app. And I'm going to use the try and catcher. So this is one way that if your code doesn't work, you can catch errors. So it's a little bit of a better way to present your code when you've got the try and the catch, in case you do have any errors or issues within the code. So it's a good way to debug it. So setting up the const, and then we're using the HTML service, and we're creating a template from a file. So we want to generate a template from a file, and then this is going to be dynamic. So we're going to be updating this template name using a variable. So let's set that up as well. And that's going to be outside on the root. So creating a temp, and that means that we also need to create a template called index. So let's save that. And within the script, we're going to create a new HTML file and give this a name of index. And then within this HTML file, we'll set up the h1, hello, this is page index, and then close that off. Let's go back into our So we've got the try. We haven't set up the catch yet, so that's why we're throwing that error there. And we also want to maybe pass in some data in case we want to make this dynamic. So let's pass in an object value here, and we'll just take the title of the template and pass in the template object so that we can see what information we're passing as a value, and then we can use that value when we evaluate the template. So on the doGet, let's return the HTML object. So take HTML, and because we're creating a template from a file and we want to evaluate it because we want to pass the data through, so make sure you include the evaluate in order to run the code. So we're still missing the catch. So we've got the try, and if there are any errors or issues, then we can use catch. And so what catch will do is we want to generate, and for this one, we'll create some HTML using HTML service. Let's create the just regular HTML output, and within the HTML output, we can write out the HTML as an error that we're getting, just the error, and then we'll return this object, so return the HTML. And we don't have to evaluate unless we want to pass through some values into the error. You can also take the value from the error and you can output it. So if we wanted to as well, we could stringify that value. So let's do that, and we'll concatenate it together. So JSON stringify what we've got for the error. So that way we're going to be outputting the error content into the HTML if we are throwing an error. So let's go ahead and create and deploy our web app so that we can get the URL for testing. Select the type of deployment, selecting a web app. And then who has access, who the app is executing as. Run the deployment so that when we go to the web URL, it will run the code that's contained within the doGet function. And once you've got the web URL, you can open up the web URL and check out the content that you've got. So this should be rendering out the index page. We can also check under the inspect, and we're not outputting any of the content yet, so we're going to do that as well, and we'll update and add to the code. So that we can do within the HTML, where if we wanted to get the content that's contained within the data object that's being passed here, let's set up our script tags. And this is just running regular JavaScript front-end code. So the objective of this function is to pass the server-side data value into the client side. So you just call it data or data.js. I usually like to call it data.js for data Google scripts. So I know that's where it's coming from, and that's the source of it. So we want to output the data value, and we can take the JSON and stringify the data object, and then close off the scriptlet. And for now, we'll just console log the data.js content. And also we'll use JavaScript. So document write, and we'll write the content that's contained within the data.js. So using JSON stringify, let's stringify the JavaScript content, and this is just straight JavaScript. So that way we see the parameters that are being output on the page, and we don't always have to open up the console. So let's go to the dev deployment so you can get that under the test deployments, and that's going to provide you the web dev value. So we get the title of index that's being passed in as one of the parameters here. So we've got the value from the script, and that means that we can use that value within the script and generate, so checking to see if we have a particular value and if we want to update the temp. So updating const to let, and let's update this value and check to see how we want to identify the value. So we can maybe call it page or something like that, and check to see if page is in e parameters. And the parameters are what's being passed here within the event object. We can also log that information out. So e, and then JSON stringify whatever the event object is, so that we can see that information within the data. So checking to see page in e parameters, And if it is, then we're going to rewrite and update the value of temp to e parameter. And it's actually should be parameters. And as we saw in one of the earlier lessons, that parameters, so we're picking that up within an object array format. So we want to select the parameter with whatever the value is, and actually that should be page. And we only want to pick up the first one. So with the parameters, you have an option to store multiple values. With parameter, it will only pick up the first instance of that value of page. So let's use the parameters, and we'll pick up the value of the page, and this also allows us to update that value. So let's try the code in the dev version and run the code, and we'll do an inspect of it into the console. So we do have an object that's passed, and within the event object, this is a string value that's being passed in there. So you can also update this so it's not passing a string. And let's run that one more time. So it's going to be a lot cleaner, and within the JavaScript object, that's going to be an object as well. And we know with objects that we can loop through them in the console. So if we do set a value of page and we set the page to index, that should still produce the index value, but this is now coming in dynamically because we're setting the page value and getting the parameter. So if we do something like page 2, so page equals index 2, let's see what happens. So we ended up throwing an error, and we ran the error. So we've got the try and the catch, and we were able to produce the error. So within this error, we can also say page not found. And this can be used something similar to what a 404 error might be. So update that code, refresh it, and we've got page not found 404 error. So it doesn't allow you to continue, it just gives you some indication that that page is not found. Now let's update it back to index, and we see that we get the page being output there. So for the index, let's make a copy of it, and we will create a page that has index 2. And now let's go over to index 2. And we'll just write index 2 there. And now let's call to, within the web URL, within the parameters, we're calling to index 2, and then we're outputting the page accordingly. So that's going to be the second page that we've created, and then we can output that content. So now, depending on what the web URL, what the parameter is within the URL, if we've got a parameter called page and we're equaling that to an existing page, we're going to return back the page template. And if we're just equaling it to something that doesn't exist, then we're going to throw an error and return back the page not found in the catch method. So that's how you can use the try and the catch in order to catch any issues or errors. And then as well, where you can set the page template within the e parameters and pick that up and use that and dynamically change the templates depending on what the URL is. So coming up next, I've got some the next part of this project. So we're going to continue to develop out the multi-page web app. So before we conclude, let's just make a new deployment of it so that the executable is working. We'll call it v2 and run the code, and let's go out to the executable. And we'll check it out, just make sure it works. So index is equal to 2. If we enter in a page that doesn't exist, we're going to return back the error with the 404 code. Let's continue to build our application. So in this lesson, we're going to continue to build out the functionality of our multi-page web app. So we created a few pages last time, and we want to link some of these pages together, as well as we want to get some dynamic content within the page. So we can do this with JavaScript, where we can track and we can output the page title if we want as well. So we are passing this as an object value. So that means that we can select and we can update some content that's contained within this page. So let's go ahead and select that, and using the document object, and then query selector, and this is typical front-end code for JavaScript. And let's take the H1 and update the text content. And the text content is going to pull back the information that we have under the data.js title. So data.js object and title. So it will dynamically update the content in there. And I'm going to use the template literals, so the backticks there, to update some of this content. And then let's create a for to generate some content while I is less than 100 and increment I. So we'll generate some random text on the page. And also let's create a container for that content. So we'll call it output, and then using document create element, and the element that we're creating is going to be a div. And then using document body, we'll append the output container to the page. And now let's generate some content within the output. So we'll set output inner HTML, and we'll just add to the current inner HTML. So using math random, generate some content, so text string, so turn it into a string. So using the JavaScript string method, that actually should be uppercase. And the number of characters that we want to return back. So if we want substring, so 2, and also let's create another math value. So this is going to be a temporary value for the length. So using math floor, and then math random method again. And we'll get up to 8 characters there. So we'll substring and val, and actually let's add 1 to that. So we've got the substring of characters that we want to return back, and we're turning it into a string value, and then that's updating the HTML. So let's see what that looks like on the page, and we're running it within the dev version. And selecting the index page. That's why we're not seeing it. So also let's add in a space so that they look a little bit more like words. So now we've got just some random content characters there. And I'm going to add, now in order to add this script to other pages, of course we can rewrite the script, or we can set a separate file for that. So let's create, it's actually going to be a regular, so let's create another HTML, and I'll call this random words file. And then within the random words file, all that's going to contain is going to be this script content. So we can get rid of the rest of the HTML. So this is an HTML file, so we have to include the HTML properly into the pages. But what we want to do is we want to include this file in the other pages. So the include, you can create an include function within the Google Apps script. And this is a really useful function that you can call and include the script files at any point. So let's take and return back the file name that we want to include. And then we'll do our return using the HTML service, create output from a file, and generating the output from whatever the file name that's passed in. So now if we want to use this function, we can use this function within the project and return back content that's contained within that project. So let's say, for instance, we want to render out the script tag. All we'd have to do is do an include on the file. So let's update the HTML, and using the script tags to render the script content, and then selecting the include function. So this is running on the server side. So whatever function we want to include, we can include it at this point. And one of the functions it's not going to run is it's not going to render out the title. So that's not a value that we can select unless it's always passed in. So then that way we can select it as data.js. So it would have to be present within the current script. So this is possible that it can run. We'll try it out and we'll just make sure. So what we want to do maybe here as well is to create an element instead of having an element on the page, just in case we're running a page that doesn't have the script content. And then we'll output the h1 on the page itself. So selecting that h1 object. And also you got to be mindful of the fact that you don't want to be selecting existing objects that are on the page. So when you're including the script, you don't want to be selecting existing ones either. And before we run it, this actually should be a question mark. So now let's go out to the dev version and try to run the page, see what happens. So we get the as an HTML output object that's being output on the page. So when we're including it, we're generating the code. It's HTML output on the file page. So we're still getting it as an object, and in order to fix that, use the getContent method. So this will return it back as regular HTML content. And you can see that, let's create a quick test function for this so that we can see the difference within the log, where if we're just outputting this HTML object, and let's output the index.html. And within the logger log, output the getContent object, and then we'll output it without the content as well, is what we've currently got. And this actually should be a string value. So let's run our tester function and see what we get within the console. So in the first case, we get the HTML output, which is the same thing we've got here. So that's just outputting the object name. And in the second one, we're actually rendering out the content that's contained within the file. So that's definitely the one that we want. So let's go back in and do a refresh of the page. And now we're rendering out the contents of the file. And also notice that the index is working, so we're able to update and send that index value. So within the random words, let's do one more. And we'll take the contents of this file and we'll run to uppercase. And then here we'll just output the title. So that will uppercase the content. And this way we can have as many includes of this file as needed. And we can also include style sheets that we can use across the multiple pages. So we know when we're developing content, we don't want to be rewriting the code in each one and having to go over to each file and open up. So we want to link to one common file, and that's what this function is going to allow us to do. So let's go create one more file for the style sheet, and I just called it style1. So this is a regular HTML file, and within here we can render out the style contents that we want to share across all the pages. So let's select the body, and within the body we'll set the background and set the background to set it to blue and save it. And now we're importing the style file across all of them, and H1 has already been declared, so it looks like we're running it into an issue there. So what we can do is we can wrap this function into another function called random words. And so the first time we're calling that, and then the next time let's create a new file, and HTML file again. We'll just call it random2. And then this is a script file that's going to be referencing that script So we'll be referencing the random words function that we've just created. And here we can run that function multiple times. So you do have to be a little creative with how you're adding in these scripts since you've already declared it. It's just like JavaScript in the regular front-end code where you'd have to bring the source code in, and if you are setting the variables, then you got to be mindful of the fact that these variables are already set within the scope, so we don't want to be resetting them using const or anything like that. So that's why we're wrapping it within a function, and instead of calling that function multiple times, we're going to call it one time, and then the second time we can create a separate function that will run the random words functionality. So this way, when we go to the page, we can output the content from that function multiple times without having any collision with the setting of the variables that we've already set. So now we've got this functionality and we can continue to build this app. So for the app, we typically might want to share a menu to the other pages. So that's what we're going to be setting up in the next lesson, where we're going to be setting up a menu that will work across pages. We've also set up the style sheet. So let's go over, and we've got the include on the style 1. And let's see what happened here. And actually, let me remove out the quotes there. And try that one more time so that we get the blue background for the styles. And maybe we want to have white text. So select the color of the font, and we can set that to white. So there we go. That's how we can make use of multiple files and bring them into the project. Coming up next, we're going to wrap up this project. So in this lesson, we want to include a menu that's going to work across pages. And as well, I'm going to disable the top part there where we're document writing the parameters. We're not going to need those anymore. And before we go to complete and create some more pages, I want to add in a menu into this page. So selecting our script, let's go ahead and we're going to include a menu file. So we actually want to run some code on the back end. We saw that with the include that we were able to run some code. And in this case, we just want to generate some HTML content. And this is going to be a menu that's going to be shared across multiple pages. So we can run the menu function. And within the menu function, that's where we can build out the content. And let's create some code around that within the Google script. So going down here below, and this is where we're going to generate the menu. So taking the function and creating the menu function. And we just want to return back some content. So we're going to get the URL of the current script object. So get script URL method. That's going to return back the script URL. And then within the HTML service, so using HTML service, we're going to create output, and that should be a dot there. Create output from a file, and we'll create a HTML file index. And the same thing that we did before, where we're using the get content value. And we're going to update the HTML with whatever the URL is that we've just got from the script side. So passing in from the server side and updating the HTML content. So at this point, we've got the HTML object. And if we run menu, let's see what type of menu we've constructed. And we don't have the page yet, so let's go over to create the menu page. So this is going to be our menu file. And within here is where we can create and construct what we want our menu to look like. So let's wrap it in a div. And we'll just create a very simple menu here. So maybe you even want the unordered list and the list items. And then within here, we've got the href. and linking out to where we've got the menu. So we're going to equal that and taking the page value, so whatever page we want to redirect to. So let's say, for instance, we know we've got index and target. So setting the target to top is crucial for this to work. So make sure that you do set it to top. And then whatever the name of the page is, index. Or we can just call this the home page. And this is just up to you how you want to present it to the users. So it's the list items and then closing off the unordered list. So far we just have the one item, and I'll include an HR bar. Going back to the menu function, we could hard code the URL that we want to use, but we also want it to work within the dev version. So there's a way to get the script URL. So we're going to create a function that's going to return back the script URL. So selecting the URL object and then using the script app, we can get the service, and under get service method, we can get the current URL of the web service. And so we can return that as a value. So you can also update this at any time. And what this is going to do is this is going to pass through the URL, and we're going to update the HTML code with that URL value. So let's run the menu and we'll see what we've got currently. So we've got our web page, and we want to update this menu value with whatever the current URL is. So let's do that, and then we'll output the content. So we want to make sure that we're generating the HTML property. So set up the HTML and equal that, so reassign the value of HTML. And we're going to use the replace method, replacing wherever we've selected, and we've got the equal to page. So taking this part of the HTML code, and we're going to replace that. So using the regular expressions and flagging it with a G, so that's going to select all the global values of it. So we need to break out of the question mark there and returning it back as the page, and then comma separate it out with what we want to update it with. So we're going to update it with the temp and then equal that to the page object. And that should actually be question mark temp. So that will update and actually just add the URLs in each one of the pages. So let's see what that looks like. So now we've got the script URL added in. And this is nice because this will work if we've got multiple items here. So we can add as many items into the menu, and we don't have to worry about constantly updating the URL. And I know it's a fairly long URL, so we can be mindful of that. We can update the URL as needed. So set that to index 2, and this can be index 3, and we'll create the index 3. So take index, and we'll make a copy of it, and the copy of index will be index 3. So that's our new index 3 page. So that way we've got the menu and we've got the include content already set. And let's go over to index 2, and we'll add in the menu into this page. So this page is going to be slightly different. And then index 3. So it looks like we're ready to give it a shot and add in the menu. So the menu is within the code, but it's not rendering out. So let's go take a look and see what's going on there within the index page. And I did forget the question mark. So that's why it wasn't rendering there. So don't forget to include the question mark there. And I'm going to have to update that for the other item as well. So what the reason it's not showing is that it's not returning. So let's update the menu items that we had on the various pages where we're referencing it. And then after this, whatever updates we make to the menu is going to propagate across all the pages. So the one last part is that where we're rendering the code within the code GS, we need to return back some content for the menu so that way it can get rendered out. So we need to return the HTML. And we are already getting the content. We're doing a find and replace of the content. So it looks like we're ready to check it out and see if it works. So we've got all 3 items there, and I'm also going to update the style. So now that we've got it connected this way, we can really easily make selections, update the content as needed, and so on. And this will now be across all of the pages. So we can select 2, we can select 3, and we can navigate through multiple pages within the web app, and that's going to be all using the event object within the parameters of the web page. And so this way, it makes it really easy to add content, and you can create it just as you would any other website, where you just need to include the files that you want to use that are running the code on the server side, and they can render it out. So for instance, if you want 2 different style pages, we can easily just make a copy of it and give this one a new name. And also keep in mind that this should always be rendered out as with the script tags. So with the style tags and the script tags, otherwise it's not going to work. So let's go over to index 3 and make an update to it. So instead of style 1, we'll use style 2. And then also let's go over to our menu, and all of a sudden we realize we want to make some changes to this menu. So let's update the style properties. And you could also use the style sheet as well now. So style, and let's do the display as inline block. So let's see what happens. So refresh. And let's add a different background color to this. So the background, and I'll just set it to red. So now for the menu, we've got a red background. And then of course you can style the menu however you need to. So go ahead and set up and update your project, and it looks like we're not pulling in a style for that. So let's see what happened with index 3 there. And maybe that's not a good background color. And let me update that again. So you can add as many pages as you need into your project this way. This lesson, we're going to be creating an interactive dock. So that means that we're going to be creating sidebar as well as a modal pop-up, which are going to interact with the content within your dock. So let's go ahead and demonstrate this. And this is actually one of the most common asked for functionalities by students in order to create customized interfaces and interactions within the doc content. So this next set of lessons will show you how to build this type of interface. And then of course you can customize it and add styling as needed. So the basic functionality is going to be covered in the upcoming lessons. So we've got a sidebar that will pop up, and this is within the UI interface and updating the sidebar. So it's actually coming from an HTML template file that we've created within the front end code. So we're allowed to add styling, and then we've just got some regular inputs here. So it's got 2 input fields, and these input fields allow us to save some content and add it to the doc. We add a heading and then a paragraph, and the paragraph is going to be in green. So we can add as much of this content as we want. And the other interface and the other dialog box is going to be one that's going to list out the page elements. So it's just got a button here that lists out the page elements. So it lists out all of the elements, the paragraphs, and then you can select them and remove them. So right now what it's just doing is it's updating the content within the paragraph to say remove. You can also create whatever interaction you want for the paragraph element. You can remove it from the page. You can update the text. You can update the styling. So as long as you're able to select it, you can make those types of interactions. So I can list out another set. We'll do a new listing, and we automatically get that same interaction. So a lot of the code here, it's a great example of code snippets where you can demonstrate how we can get content into the Google script side from the client side, and then also pass content back to the client side, and then do some regular client side interactions. The client side interactions are done with JavaScript, so this is just regular plain JavaScript, and then there's also some styling with CSS as well as the HTML structure, and it allows us to use the Google Script Run service, where we can pass information and connect to a function directly on the Google Script side of things. So let's get started in the next lesson building out this custom interface into Google Docs. Go ahead and go over to the Drive, create a brand new doc. So just create a blank document, and this document is going to be used for the UI application that we're going to be building. So connecting to the UI, which is going to interact using a template, a dialog template, to do some stuff within the Google Doc. So Docs, so we just call it UI Docs. And then from here, select under Tools, Script Editor, and that's going to open up our Google Apps Script Editor. And this, we'll just give it also a matching name. So UI Docs, and I'll call it UI Docs Script. So let's add to the onOpen function. So we'll add, because this is a bound script, so we have the option to add a simple trigger, and the trigger that we're adding is the onOpen. And once the onOpen is clicked, then we can select the UI object, so using the document app, and get the UI object. So it's going to allow us to interact with the UI. And we'll have a couple different types of UIs. So we'll have a sidebar as well as a dialog. So those are optional, and typically you might only just need one, but this will give you some variety in different options that you have for the UI options. So within the UI object, go ahead and create a menu. So you can do an add-on menu or just can do a menu. I'll do it as a separate menu. And the add-on menu, again, is the one that you see when you go under add-ons, and you'll see the add-on menu from there. So within the UI, let's go ahead and add an item. So first item is going to be the sidebar. So give it a name of sidebar, and then the function that we want to run also within a string format, and I'll call it sidebar. And we'll add in the functionality into each one of these functions. And this is going to be the dialog, and we can call this show dialog. So that gives us the two functions that we can work with. And then lastly, we want to add it to the UI so that all the users that are accessing it and have editor permissions are able to interact with the UI. And let's we can run the onOpen. So it's going to add the tab to the left or to the right of the help tab in the menu bar. So going back in here, there's our two functions set up and ready to go. So let's populate some content into the functions. And actually, I'm going to change this to show sidebar. And let's create the functions that are going to be associated with these actions. So, and then we'll write out the code of the block of code that we want to run within these functions. So usually I do like to just create the function, even if it's just a placeholder, so that I don't forget that the function is needed, and then you can run into some errors within the script if you haven't added the function properly. So we want to select a particular sidebar menu, and we can use the template from file. So let's create that file template, and I'll just call it side, so we can reference this within the code, and creating the HTML template. And this will just be regular HTML code in using HTML service. Let's create the template from file, and then whatever the file name is. So this is requiring a parameter within a string format referencing the index.html. So you don't have to include index.html. Even if you do include the index.html, it should still work, but you just need to include the whatever the file name is that you want to reference that's going to be within the files here in your script editor. So for this file, let's take the HTML and we want to evaluate it. So we want to run any of the code that's currently there. And also let's string together some additional functions. Let's set a title for this. So whatever we want as the title. And I'll just call it doc updater because that's the function that we're going to be doing. And then now let's select the document app, get the UI menu. So you don't have to put it into a variable unless you're going to be calling to it. So in this case, we're just going to be showing the dialog, and we already have the HTML for the dialog. We can show a modalless dialog or just a regular dialog. So let's just select show the dialog. And actually I'm going to show the modalless dialog, and what that will do is that will still allow us to interact with the content. And actually this one should be the sidebar, and then the other one we're going to show the modalless dialog. So selecting the sidebar and then passing in the HTML that we want to render out within that sidebar. So that will pop up that file whenever that menu item is clicked. So let's try it, the sidebar. And we need to provide authorization to interact with the doc. So if you don't provide it within the script area, when you try to run the script on within the doc, it's going to ask you for the permissions. So go through and set the permissions. And let's make a few updates to the code. So actually we want to set and do the evaluate directly on the HTML object. So we don't want to call it separately. So we can do it this way, and we can also set the title on the HTML object as well, and then render out the HTML in the sidebar. So let's go ahead and try it, and that will open up the sidebar. So there's our sidebar, and that's coming from the HTML file. So going over to the sidebar, let's add in some code here, and then we're going to be updating it and having it interact with our Google script afterwards. So whenever we run the sidebar, we render out that sidebar file, and let's go back into the script, and we're going to update the dialog as well. So this is going to be showing the dialog values. So for this one, for the dialog, there's actually some more properties that you can set. So you can set the title, and also just notice that where the title is going to be present. So that's just up here in the top of the sidebar when you open it up. So within the sidebar, we're going to create a new file, and I can duplicate this one, and this will be the dialog file. And within here, let's just write the word dialog, and we'll take care of the script afterwards. So what we want to do is we want to render out that file. And using the same HTML service, make sure that we select the file property. So that's by the name of dialog. And then we can also set some of the parameters here within the HTML object. So we've already evaluated. So let's go ahead and select, we can set the title of it. And you can chain together various methods. There's also one to set the width, so how wide we want the dialog to be. So I guess this also depends on how much content you're presenting. You can set the height of the dialog, so how much height for the dialog object. And then once you've set the parameters, you're ready to use the document app. And let's get the UI object. And then within the UI, we're going to show the modalless dialog. So it does require the 2 parameters here for the modalless dialog. And of course, you can always select and get more details. So we want to output the HTML. And it also, you can use a title as well within the dialog. So here they've got an example of it where we're creating HTML output. So we've got the HTML and then the title that we want to use. So in this case, we don't have to set the title over here. We can select and we can set the title within the show modalless dialog method. So now let's try that one, and we can close the sidebar, click the dialog, and we need to provide authorization to the script once again. So go through, set the authorization for the script, and we're going to allow the script to create the modal and run the modal one more time. And so it looks like it ran into an error that it's not able to find the my dialog. And I just need to update this to my dialog. So let's dismiss that and try that one more time. So that gives us the dialog. And notice that the modal-less dialog, that still allows us to interact with the content in the background and have the dialog box open as well. And we can close that. So go ahead and add in the sidebar, the dialog, and you're going to be ready to move on to the next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to continue to build out the interaction that we set out to last time. And one of the interactions that we want to create is have the pop-up and then the sidebar have some input fields here, and then have those input fields populate some content on the page. So let's select the sidebar or the side HTML. And from here, we can create some inputs that we're going to get some content from, and then we can get the content from the inputs and add it onto our page. So we can call this content adder. And then within the functions here, we need to let's create a div. And that div can wrap around the inputs. And then within the inputs, we're going to have some parameters that we're going to be asking for. So the first input is going to be asking for the title or the heading. So set up the name. And we'll just call it name heading. And I also set the input type as just regular text type. And I'm going to set a default value so we don't have to always populate it. And of course, this can be changed as needed. I'm actually going to use an ID. And then for the label, so that we can label this and set and connect to the label. So the label for heading. So let's say add heading and then close off the label tags. And let's also add one more input. And we need to add in a button that will save and populate the content. So this will be the text that we want to add. So we're going to be appending some text. So it'll be for a paragraph. Give it an ID for a paragraph. And actually, instead of having an input, let's have a text area. Because for the paragraph, we probably want to have more space. So set up a text area. And for a text area, we don't need these attributes. And this will just have some text area content. And then the last part is let's add in a button, the button that can be clicked. So we can keep this wrapped within a div as well so that we can apply styling later on if we want. Let's add in the button. And this is just a class of, and I'll just give it a class of adder. And save to doc. And then close off the button. So what this will do whenever we open the sidebar, we should have some input fields there. Let's apply some styling to that. And you can also use an editor like on your computer and then just do the styling there as well. So let's select input text area, and for labels, and I'll just do a display block so that they move to the next line. And let's see what that looks like. And of course, you can apply whatever styling that you want as needed. So I'm just going to leave it at this, but again, you could apply styling as needed. Maybe to the body, we want to apply some styling there as well. And set the color to be white, and we'll just set the background and set the background to be kind of a dark color. So that just was, you can apply whatever styling is necessary to the project as needed. So we want to make this interactive, and we do this with JavaScript. And you can as well bring in a file, external file. So you can use the includes as we saw last time, or you can hard code the include function where we're going to be using the HTML service and create HTML output from file, and then we can select our JavaScript file. So side.js is going to be the file name, and then we just want to render out the content and save. So let's create the style.js file, side.js file. And so what this one will be doing, so don't forget the script tags. So opening and closing the script tags, as this is just going to be JavaScript. And maybe in the console we can log some information just to make sure that the file is connected, and then afterwards we can add in the script for that. So close that, and this is running in the browser. So we can open up the code inspector, the developer tools, and that will output whatever content we've got here. And we see that we do have the ready there. So that's working and that's connected. And that means that we can also apply some JavaScript where we can select some content from there. And if we want to select the element with a class of adder and make the button clickable, so let's do that. We'll select the button object, and using the document query selector, let's select the element with a class of, going back, just make sure that we do get the class properly. So it's the class of adder. And then to the button, so adding an event listener. So we're listening for the event of a click. And the click is going to invoke a function. And on this function, we'll just log out clicked, just to make sure that, again, that everything is working. And let's update that to query selector and hit the sidebar. Clear the console, and now when we click it, we do get the word clicked there in the console. So that's what we want. We've got the functionality now, we've got the selection, and let's also add in these values. So we're going to have the text area and the heading, and add them in as objects so that we can select the content that's contained within it. And then we're going to move on to updating the modal. So content header, and using the same method, document selector, we're going to select the header, the element with the header ID. And just to double check, make sure that we do have the elements. So it's para is the other one. And this is going to be the content paragraph. So we're selecting the two elements. And let's double check and just make sure that we're not throwing any errors in the JavaScript code. So everything looked like it's working properly. And now we're ready to update the dialog. So within the dialog, we'll do something similar for the dialog. But in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to list out all of the elements on the page and the content from the page. And we'll output that in the output area. So this one will just have one button function, and that button will just run some code to add and list out all of the content. So let's select the button, add it to the dialog, and creating another element, class of output. So this is where we can output all of the content that we're going to be constructing, and this is all going to come from the document object. So this is going to list out all of the page elements within the doc. And just as we did with side, we're going to link to the JS file. So within the dialog. And if you want to repurpose the JavaScript files, you can repurpose them. In this case, I'm going to make a separate one. But we can also link to the same one as well if needed. So selecting that, and let's just make a copy of it. And I'll call it dialog.js, and save that. And what this one will do, we'll select the element for output as an object named output. So selecting the element with a class of output, and then we'll take the button as it's clicked and we'll output the element onto the page. So let's try the dialog and just see if it works. keep your DevTools open so that we can check the JavaScript that it's running properly. So we want to list out the page elements, and that's allowing us to select the dialog that we have. So what we want to do for this function, it's going to list out the content from the doc. So coming up next, we'll continue to build out the interaction to this project. In this lesson, we're going to continue to build out the interaction. And in this case, we're going to be sending some content back to the server side. So doing a Google script run and sending some of the data that we've got from the client side to the server side, and then using some type of interaction with it. And in this case, for the sidebar, we're going to be updating and adding a paragraph and a header element to the page whenever the button is going to be clicked. So we want to pass back the object information back to the server side. So using the Google script run service, and we're going to run this with success handler. So what the success handler does is this is going to run a callback function, and so here it's expecting a parameter, so we can just use a string value for a success function. And then let's create the function. So this is the function that's going to run. It's going to get some content back or results back, and then we'll log that out into the console. And then we can also update the user interface with that information as well. So now that we've run the success, we can also set a failure handler as well. And we just need to specify which function we want to run. So I'm going to create a function that's called add to doc. We'll pass over 2 parameters. So the first parameter is going to be the header information. So you can set up a separate variable for that. Or you can even set up an object that's going to contain that. So how about we do that, and then we'll pass the object back to the server side. So we'll have the h1. And that's going to have the content header value, so coming from the client side. And for the paragraph, we're going to get the content paragraph value from that input field. And on the server side, we're going to pick up that object information and do something with it. So creating a function called add to doc. And let's go into the Google script side of things and create our new function. And this function has the 2 parameters that are coming in, so the header and the paragraph content, and that's coming from the server side. So what we want to do with this, where we want to update the content contained within the main document body. So let's select the body of the document, and using the document app, we can get the active document, because we know there's an open active document, get the body object. So that allows us to start interacting with the body object. And let's select the header. And for this, we can use the body and just append paragraph. And this paragraph is going to contain the header text that was passed into the function. So we also want to update the style of the header. So because we want this to be a header style, so we need to add that in. We're going to add that in as an object, and then take style and set the properties of style. So using the document app attributes, selecting the attributes. So what type of attribute do we want? We want a heading attribute. So let's select that and take the document app and paragraph heading, and we can set it to the H1 heading. So it's going to create an H1 heading for that content. So next we just need to apply that style. So take the header and set the attributes, setting the attributes of style so that we've got the heading tag. And then the other part is we want to add in the paragraph content. So let's select that. And for this one, unless we want to apply some styling, we can just append it as a paragraph and add in that paragraph content that way. So it's optional. We can also add some background colors if we want. So that way we could set it up as content paragraph. And as long as we can reselect that object, we can set properties to it, so we can set the attributes to it as well. So let's select attributes, and we've got style 1 for this. So let's select and create the style 1 object and select the attribute. And what attribute do we want to set for this particular? We want to set the background color. And this is just requiring a value. So in this case, we can set a hex value to the background of that particular part of the code. And then also let's do a return, and we'll do a return object, and we'll just write success true. And of course you can return back additional values as needed. So it doesn't look like I've selected the object. And the suggested way is to use the dev tools and then also the console, output the element objects from the DOM just to make sure that you've selected them properly in order to debug the application, see what's going on. So let's close the sidebar, clear the console, run the code again. And I am selecting the text area, but it looks like there's a problem with the header. So let's go back to the sidebar. And actually I called it heading instead of header. So let's make an update on that. And actually I'm passing this as one object. So let's get the data as an object, and then we'll set up the variable values to match what we've got here. So we've got the h1 value and the paragraph value. So setting up h, and let's set up the value for the paragraph. And now we should be sending the data properly. And one more quick fix, because this is client-side code, so we're not actually quoting around the function. We just want the function to be called from here, so we want to just call the function directly. So what's going to happen is that when we do add to doc, it's going to send the object information to the Google script. The Google script is going to take the data object and take out the pieces of the data, so the properties, and return back the value of h1 to h, value of data p to p, add the paragraph, append some styling to make it a heading 1, and then also append a paragraph with the paragraph content and set some background color to that newly appended paragraph content. And at the end, it's going to return back success true, which is going to go back to the client side, and that's going to be picked up as data and output into the console. So I think we're ready to try this and see what happens. So let's clear the console, and we'll clear out the code that we have there. So let's run the sidebar and put in the test content. And we see we get returned back success true, and then whatever content we have here within the input fields, that's being inserted directly within the document, being appended to the document. So whatever content we want to add, we can easily append and add it into the document. So for the dialog part, what we want to do for that one is we want to open up the dialog box, and that has to list out all of the page elements when we click the button. So it's going to be predominantly interacting with the success function. So whenever the button is clicked, we're going to just run over to the server side. We'll have a success function as well. And then within the success function, from the data that's returned back, we're going to list out all of the object information onto the page. So let's copy paste, and this is going to be list else. So it's going to be listing all the elements. We're not passing any parameters, and we're just going to output right now the response back from the server into the success, so into the console. Let's create the function on the server side. And then within here, we're going to select the content of the body. And in the logger log, so as we develop this, we can get the content, that's all of the elements that are contained within there. So let's get we can get the paragraphs as well. So get all of the elements. And actually, how about we select the paragraphs, because we've been adding paragraphs, so we'll select all of the paragraphs. And from here we can run this because we're not passing any parameters, so we don't need a special test function. We can list out all of the paragraphs that we have on the page. And let's put them into a paragraph object that we can iterate through. And I'll also create an object, so I'll create this as an object that's going to hold some values. And then as we list out for each one of the paragraphs, we can return back the paragraph information, and also we can return back the index value as well. And then from here, we're going to push that information into holder, and within the log, we'll output what the final results of holder are. And then that's what we're going to be returning back to the client side, and then we'll loop through it on the client side and just output that within the HTML, all using just JavaScript. So as we loop through the contents, let's construct a temporary object. And this object can hold some data about what the contents of the paragraph is. So let's add in the type of the paragraph. So selecting the paragraph, get type of the paragraph. Content is going to be get so we'll get the text of the paragraph. And this object, we're going to take holder and push the contents of the object into the holder as we construct it. So that way all the objects within the array holder are going to all be the same. So let's run that and output the content. So see, this is what we get returned back. So first one, content, nothing. Second one, content, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. So this way we can loop through all of these. And if there's any additional information that we want to get, so if we want to get the ID or something else, let's see what else we can get. And if we get the attributes, see how the attributes get listed out. So it lists out all of the attributes. That might actually be a little bit long to get that, but that's also an option. So you can get various values as you iterate through each one of the paragraphs. And then next, we're going to take that returned value and then make use of it within the function. So let's just return back holder. And now from the client side, we can get the dialog box, and I'll clear out the console, and we'll list out the elements. And so this is coming back to the client side within the JavaScript, and now it's just a matter of looping through them and outputting them on the page and doing whatever else we want with them. And we're going to be updating this and completing this mini application in the next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to be wrapping up the project that we've been working on. So we've got a couple interfaces that we have, and these are just some interactive functions that we've added into the docs toolbar. So we've got a sidebar menu that pops up, and this sidebar allows us to have a couple of input fields, and using these input fields, if we save to doc, it's going to output and add the content into the doc. And then the other interaction is that we've got a dialog box, and this dialog is going to have list page elements. So that will allow us to list out all of the current page elements, and we can have different properties that we're returning back here as well, and listing them all out here within the Google script. So let's create and wrap up the interaction. And also another thing is that what we can pick up is we can get the index value of that particular element by using the index. And then we could use that if we want within the client side to connect to that element from the paragraphs. So we can select the paragraphs, and then we can identify which paragraph we want to create the interaction with. And that can all as well come from the client side. So now within the dialog box, we're returning back the object, and we've got the code within the dialog.js. So we're returning all of that information back as a data object. So that means that we can take the data object and use for each to loop through each one of the elements that is being returned back. And for now, we can console log out each one of those elements. And then what we want to do is we want to actually add it to the page. So let's clear out the output inner HTML and just clear any existing content that we might have there. And then as we iterate through and as we loop through, so we're creating brand new divs, and within these divs, so using the document create, and that should be a dot, to create element, and the element that we're creating is going to be a div, and then within this div we can add in the content of the div. So set the text content, and that will be the content of the L itself, the element itself. And let's just go back to the UI menu. So we have type, and then we also have content. And also before we add it, I just want to make sure that the L content length is greater than 0 so that we actually do have some content. We don't want to add any paragraphs without content. So selecting, adding the content, and then lastly, let's take from the output and we'll do append of the content of div. So that will generate a bunch of divs with the content from the page. So close and try to list out within the dialog. And I'll clear out the existing content. So this lists out all of the page elements. And as we're constructing these, we can also add event listeners to these. So let's add event listener. And we'll listen for a click event on this element. And if it does get clicked, then let's run a function. And what do we want to happen when it does get clicked? So let's take the console log and see what types of information we've got. So we've got an index value. So let's output the element index value. And then this can serve as a value that we can remove the paragraph, a certain paragraph. So let's try that one more time. Open up the dialog. List the page elements. And so this is returning back the index values that are associated with it. So at this point, we can run a separate function that can pass that value back to the server side. And at this point, we can remove that. So how about we do that, we'll remove. And this will just remove. And instead of running success, and it'll remove the element with this value. And we'll create the function to remove the element, load, and we'll run a function called load list on the callback. So that's our load list function. And this one will actually do the same functionality that we've got here. So, and then eventually it'll run the success function. So load list, we can copy it on the click event. And that will simplify some of our code. And save. So let's select and create the function for removing the element. And this is going to be just a regular function within our Google script. It's going to have a value, which is going to be the index value of the element that we want to remove. So let's go ahead and select that paragraph. And we want to get all of the paragraphs. So some of the code is going to be the same. And within the logger log, right now, for now, what we'll do is we'll log out that para and whatever the value is that's being passed in. And we'll set some text into it. And actually, I'll remove out the logger. So let's see what happens and run all of the code. Let's clear it out. Let's do the dialog. List the page elements. And so it's updating these to be remove. You can see it's being updated on the page as well. So let's pick that first one that we've got heading, and then let's take this one. So that's that one there. So we can create this type of interaction between what's happening within the dialog box, tie it back into the elements within the doc, and then do some more functionality as needed within the client side. So it's going to be just regular client side script, so JavaScript and CSS, and then of course HTML. And then passing the information back and forth can be done with the Google Script Run service, and that allows you to have success handlers, which are callback functions, and then also specify and create your own custom functions. And that's a wrap for our application. This is one of the most common things I do get asked about, is that a lot of students, they do want to have some more advanced functionality into their Google Suite, and especially into Docs or Sheets. So this is a way that you can have some advanced functionality. You can add in a special button and create a client-side interface that interacts with the content within your Google app. So in this case, it was interacting with the doc. And I do suggest that you try the code out, make some tweaks to it, and also updates to the JavaScript as needed, and customize it to make your own solution within your Docs applications. In the upcoming 5 lessons, we're going to be building out this project all from scratch. And what this project is a way to create a web app that's going to be a customized web app that's fully dynamic, where you can update the questions within the spreadsheet, and you're also going to get the results back into the spreadsheet. And there are some benefits to doing this, that if you don't want to be sharing your spreadsheets and you just want to have a web URL that you can share the content to and have anyone come and fill out their responses and track those responses back into the spreadsheet, you can do that with this application. The other benefit of this is as well that if we change any of the questions, they're immediately changed within the web app without having to rebuild the web application. And you can see that now that new question has been updated and is reflected on the web app directly. And the other benefit is that the headings in a form, they're going to be the headings of the form questions. So if you have a rather long question, your headings are going to be rather long. So this way we can track the information in a lot neater format back into the spreadsheet, and also have the dynamic ability to generate these questions and share the web app URL on the fly. And that's all done with Google Apps Script. So connecting. And we're also generating a random order for the questions. So every time you load it, it's going to generate in a random order. There's also options to update the radio buttons. So if you want to have 10 radio buttons, or if you want to have other input questions, you can do that as well as you update the script that we're going to be working on in the upcoming lessons. So there's a number of functions that we're going to be taking a closer look at. So outputting content, creating the web app using the create template from file, and also how we can get all of the data from a spreadsheet and construct it in an object format that can then be output and utilized. So in this case, what we're doing is that the data that's coming in is constructed using the Google Apps Script and using the headings that we have within the spreadsheet, and they're associating the values that are with each one of the headings. So if you do change any of the headings, that will also change the content that's being output. So again, fully dynamic, and we try to make the quiz as flexible as possible so it's easy to update and construct different versions of it. There's also a function where we're tracking the information back that's been submitted and depositing it into the spreadsheet, or according to what the heading values are. So those heading values, again, are really important to determine where the data is going and where the data is being sent into the sheet. So if there are no corresponding headings, then the questions aren't going to be relevant and they're not going to be added into the spreadsheet. We've separated out the HTML and styling, and as well as the JavaScript, to a separate file to make it a lot easier to manage. And a lot of the work and construction is done with JavaScript. So we're using quite a lot of DOM, where we're query selecting elements, as well as creating elements, setting the attributes of those elements, and then building out the whole DOM elements. And this is all dynamically done, generated from the data as we loop through the data that's coming from the spreadsheet. All of the source code is included, and I do encourage that you create your own version of this quiz to get more familiar with what's possible with the Google Apps Script. So we submit the quiz results, we get the row value being returned back, and that's going to correspond to the entry that we have within the spreadsheet. This lesson, we're going to be setting up a customized quiz and setting up the spreadsheet in order to deliver the questions, and then creating a web app that's going to serve up the content to the user and having the web app interactions track back to the spreadsheet. So going into new, let's create a brand new spreadsheet, and this is the one that we're going to use as our quiz object. So first we're going to set up the question sheet, and this is all dynamic. So once we update the content within the spreadsheet, it's also going to update the quiz questions. So this is an easier way to create web app content for users where you can just update it in one spot. So each one of these questions is going to have an ID, and that's going to be related to the response. So we can have a question, and we can also have different pieces of information. So if we want to group the questions in specific categories, we can do that as well. I'm going to give them just question A and all the way down to 18, and how about we do 20 questions. And then we need to populate some information for the question. Actually, this is quite a bit of questions, so it's going to be dynamic. We can add other questions afterwards. So the first question will be, what do you think of Sheets? And we're going to be asking the user to provide a rating of 1 to 10, what their thoughts on our Sheets. And you can change the question types as well. This is going to be delivered with front-end code. And let's just create one more question. And we're going to all put them under group 1. So we're not going to have different groups, but this is an option that when you expand on that. So let's create another sheet, and this is going to track the results back, and we can add in the headers. So track in the user, track in the date value, also the name of the user. So maybe this one can actually be email, address, date, name, and then the responses to the questions. So right now we just have the 5 questions, and we want to track back what their value is that they're adding in. This is just going to be the heading, so we're not going to use this as part of the data, and the data is going to come into the following sheets rows. And this as well, I'll make it slightly bigger so that we can use that as a heading for our spreadsheet. So once we've constructed the spreadsheet content, go into the script, and within the script, this is where we're going to generate, first we're going to generate the quiz object. So let's create the files that we need. We need an HTML file, and this can be just given a name of quiz, and that's where we're going to output the quiz content to. So let's first set up our web app, and within the web app, let's get the user information. So actually this is going to be the user email, and using the session get active user, get email address, and we're going to pass this over to the client side so that we can use this if needed. So let's try to load the application. So using try and catch, so setting up the HTML and using HTML service, create template from file, selecting the quiz file that we just created. And let's add some data into the HTML. So create a data object that we can pass over to the client side. So this can be referenced with some data. And let's return back the data. So quiz data, we'll create a function that's going to generate the quiz data and return that back. So let's create a placeholder for that function. And right now, this function is going to just return the value of test, and then we'll populate that afterwards. So right now we're just trying to set up the structure that we want to present to the user, and then we've also got the user email. And actually, let's update this to email address. So we're passing this information over to the client side, and now let's return the content back as HTML, and we need to evaluate because we're running a template that we're evaluating. We're also passing data over. Let's also set up the catch. That's why we're throwing that error there. So for the catch itself, we can just return back and just return back a value of page not found. So using the HTML service, let's create HTML output. And in this HTML output, so this is going to be simple, not found. So if we do throw any errors for whatever reason, we can still output some content to the user. So this is our basic structure for the Google script. And of course, we want to get the sheet data, and that's what we're going to be using within this function. So it's going to connect to the spreadsheet, get the data, and so that we can populate content within the web app. Let's also update this to quiz tester, rename it. And now we're ready to deploy and try out the web app. So set up a new deployment and select the type of deployment. So we're selecting it as a web app. I'm just going to call it V1, and I'm going to open this up to anyone that to have access to it. So I do want to be able to share a web URL, so anyone that has access to it, they can take the quiz, and I'll track the information back to the spreadsheet. So let's open up the new window, and we shouldn't see anything yet because we don't have any information within this. So let's close that and go into the quiz itself, and let's pick up the data that's being sent. So this is going to be the data object coming from the server side, and we need to transfer this to the client side. So transferring it into the JavaScript side of things. So that's what we're going to do in this function, where we're setting up an object called data and then picking up the content from the server side using the scriptlet setup, and then JSON stringify method with whatever data object has been sent through from the server side. And this will log out into the console. So that means that at that point, we're going to be ready to start interacting with the content. And right now, we don't have anything but some of the data values. So we should have test for data and then for email. And let's open up the developer page. And you can do that within the test deployments. And using the DevTools, open up the code inspector, and it looks like we've thrown an error there, so let's see what happened. So unexpected identifier. So let's go back and we'll see what happened within the code. And we do need to have the colon there at the end. And there's our data and our email content. So we're already bringing it into the client side. So we can use the content that's been sent from the server side to the client side. And now we can start producing the questions. So let's continue to set up the client-side code for the web app and using the form tags so that we've got a form object. And close the form object. And then within the form object, let's track some information. So setting up a div. And then within this div, setting up the label tags. So label, and this is going to be for, and I'll just give this field name an ID of email, your email, and close the label tags. And next up, let's create an input. And this is going to be type email, and also give it an ID of email. And I'll give it a name as well of email. And with the JavaScript code, what we'll do is we'll create a separate JavaScript function to run the code. So just like the last time, we're going to include the scriptlet tags. And this is going to use the HTML service and create HTML output from file. And what file do we want to use? So we'll create a file called quiz.js, and we want to render the content from that file and output it on this page. So let's create a new HTML file, call it quiz.js, and this is going to output the content on the page. Well, eventually it will output the content on the page. So we're just again setting up some basic structure, and just to make sure that all of the files are there and that we're ready to continue to build this application. So let's refresh, make sure that you're on the dev version to see if we've got the changes. So that file is running, the data is coming in from the server side. So it looks like we've got everything structured and ready to go to continue to build this application. So go ahead and set up your core structure, and coming up next, we'll get the data from the spreadsheet, the questions, and we'll output them within the format for the page, and then provide the user the ability to interact with the content and submit it back to the spreadsheet. So that's all still yet to come. In this lesson, we're going to be getting the sheet data and outputting it to the client side. So let's work on the quiz data function and select the sheet data that we're going to be outputting to the client side. So let's select this sheet by ID, and selecting the sheet ID value. And this is the same that you could do for the standalone script, so we're not doing any UI. We want to get all of the data that's available within the spreadsheet. So selecting the spreadsheet app class, let's open by ID, and we do have the ID value for the sheet itself. And then we want to select the sheet by name. So get sheet by name and the name of the sheet that we want to use. So let's just double check, and we've got it with the name of questions. So this requires it as a string value. So selecting the sheet, and then we can do this all within one statement. We can get the data range and then get all of the values contained within the data range. And so this is going to return back all of the data as a data object. Let's strip out the headings. So using the data, and that's going to be contained within the headings. And then we want the questions themselves stripped out. So remember, the sheet itself has headings at the top. So we don't want to include those in the questions. We just want all the rest of the data, because that's where the questions are going to be held. So we can do a data slice, and slicing it at row value of 1. So it's going to return back all of the question data. And let's construct the question object that we're going to be returning back to the user. So we're going to actually be returning back the questions. So looping through all of the rows that we've got. So questions, and then for each. This will return back each one of the elements, and they're all going to be one of the questions that we have. Let's create a simple object. So this is going to be an object where we can contain some more information as needed, and then eventually we're going to push that into questions. So we've got the headings. We're turning this array into an object using the headings. So for the headings themselves, want to loop through each one of the headings, and we can just output that as header. We'll also grab the index if we need. We can utilize the index within the heading. And then returning back each one of the headings, let's set up the object that's going to hold the heading. So we'll use the header and use the to lowercase. And that's a JavaScript method that will turn the string value into a lowercase value. And then we're going to assign a value of the element with its index value. And once we've created the object, we can take the questions and push the object into the questions. And now let's see what that gets output on the client side. So we do a refresh. we need to authorize this action. So let's run the code in the backend, accept the permissions. And that way we only have to accept the permissions once, so we can run the web app without having to accept permissions as long as we're running the app from that current user. So refresh. And we're looking to see that within the data, we've got the object that's being output. So all of the headings are now used as the array object names. So we've got group, ID, and question. And now we're ready to output them on the client side. So we can iterate through that data object on the client side and output the questions. So let's select the questions on the client side. And using the JavaScript, so we need just a place to output the questions. So we need to select the form object into the JavaScript side, and from there, so let's set a class. And this can just be called questions. You can give it whatever name you want. This is just a way that we're selecting it from the JavaScript, and then we're going to continue to append and add to the form object. So as we loop through and selecting that object, so using the document and query selector, selecting the element with a class of questions. And I'm just going to log questions into the console just to make sure that I've got the element object from the page properly. So we do have that form element properly. So that means that we can loop through the content. And there is actually one thing that I do want to update. So I want to update the input for the email, so we can select it by ID. And I'll call it my email, and selecting the element with a ID of email. And let's update the my email value, as we've got the email value that's coming from the data object. So if we do the data email, let's see what happens. So we'll do a refresh. So that should automatically populate that form input field with the email address. Now let's loop through the questions. So we've got it within an object called data, and that's containing another object called data. So we've got data, and we're going to loop through there and pick up each one of those elements. And for now, we'll just console log out those elements. So those are the objects that we just constructed on the server side. And looks like there's just a slight error there. And save. I'll just do a refresh of that. So we're outputting the questions as an object. So let's go ahead and construct the question content. And let's create some more structure for this. We'll correct the list of questions, and I'll just call it LQ or list Q. And using document, create element, and the element that we're going to be creating is an unordered list. And then we're going to be adding the unordered list to the questions. So take the questions and append the list Q, and then as we loop through, we'll add a list item, and using the document create element method, we'll create a list item, and for the list item, set up the text content to be the element question value. And taking list Q, we're going to append the list item to the list. So that should list out all of the questions as list items on the page. So there's all of our questions. We do need to generate the radio buttons for the responses. So let's set up a function to handle that, because this is going to take a little bit more complex coding, so it's going to save us some time, if we create a function that's going to generate input area. And what we want from the generation of the input is we want to select and pass over the element object and pick up the element object here. And then also let's pass over the main parent, so the list item. So create a function that can handle that. And then right now, before we conclude this lesson, let's update that list item with text content, the element question. So we're just breaking apart some of the logic, and the functionality should still be the same where we list out the questions, but within the generate input, in the next lesson, we're going to generate the radio buttons that are going to present the quiz content for the user according to how many questions we have. So that's coming up next. So go ahead, construct your project so that you can list out the quiz questions, and you can be ready to move on to the next part of the lesson. In this lesson, we're going to be constructing the radio buttons and also randomizing the order of the questions. So as we've got the question content coming in, we can just do a quick randomizer on this array, because this is presented with an array object, so we can do a sort of it, and adding in the randomizing of the sort object, so using the math, so subtracting math random. So this will either be positive or negative, and that's going to affect the results that get returned back for the array. So effectively it's going to be sorting that array, and we can see within the console the data object. And then after we complete the sort, it's going to random order sort the array contents. So let's see how that looks. So now it's no longer within the same order. And if we run it again, so we see scripts, docs, Gmail, sheets, docs, slides. So all of that information is being randomized. And if you want to keep the questions within the order that you do have it within the spreadsheet, by all means, you don't have to use the randomizer. That's just a quick and easy way to make the randomization. So as we come into the generator of the inputs, we want to construct all of the inputs. So let's set up a main container. So using the document create element, this is going to be our main div that's going to contain the content for the inputs for this question. And taking the elements and then appending the main container there. And I'm actually going to shorten this just to MC. So we'll append MC. And now let's construct our divs that are going to hold the question information. So we want to have one question div, and then just beneath that, we want to include all of the radio buttons. So this is going to be where we've got the main question. So div 1, and using the document create element, we'll create a div for this as well. And then this div is going to be the first div, and we've got a second div where we've got all of the radio buttons that are going to be associated with this question. So for the first div, the div 1, it's going to have the text content, and that's going to be coming from the question. And also we want to take the main container and append the div 1 into that. So that will list out all of the questions. Let's refresh, see what that looks like. And actually this should be li for the list item append. So refresh. I'll try it one more time. So now we've got all of the questions, and if we do an inspect on the code, now these are contained within the separate divs. So they're still within the list items, but they're within separate divs. And then we can apply styling to the list items afterwards to remove out the bullets and to apply the styling as needed. So this is just to create some structure for the content. So now the next thing that we want to do is we want to generate the content for div 2. So we can append div 2 and then we can make the updates to div 2. So let's do a loop, and we'll start out as loop and set it with a value of 0. And how many radio buttons do we want? So we want to have 10 radio buttons, or we want to have 5 radio buttons for that. And then increment I plus 1. And before we do the radio buttons, let's create our first span. And that's going to be document create element. And that is going to be a span. And so are the radio buttons, the main containers for the radio buttons. So for this span, we're going to append it to the div 2, append the span 1. And the content for span 1, so text content will say worst. And then as we loop through these, we're going to generate some more spans. So this will just be just a regular span, document create element. And this element that we're generating here is going to be a span. And within this element, we're going to also generate an input. So it's going to be the radio buttons that we're going to be generating here. So let's generate our input, and creating the elements. The element that we're creating is an input. So we've got quite a few elements that we're creating, and this is quite a bit of where we've got the structure for the elements that we're generating. And if we want to make them required, we can set the required to true. So if required is 1, or if I is equal to 1, then we're going to add to this and set that input to be required. So take input and required and equal that to true. So that way the user is going to use the HTML5 and make sure that the user selects that and selects the input. So now let's generate for the input. We'll set some attributes and set it as type radio. And also for input, set attribute. So set that as name. And the name is going to be whatever the value is that we've got for the element. So we've got the element question, but we also have for the element object, we've got an ID there. So we're going to use that as the ID of the radio button, or the name of the radio button. So element ID is going to be the name of the radio button. So all of the radio buttons are going to get the same name as we're looping through and we're constructing these element inputs. And that's going to give us the ability to just kind of click through them. So as we're looping through as well, let's set an attribute and set a value. And the value is going to correspond to whatever the value of I is. And actually, let me update this to be less than 6, so we do get the 5 buttons there. And you can have as many buttons as you want, so you can update this number to update the number of buttons. And also, let's add in a label to each one of these. So set the attribute. And this is going to be the ID so that we can attach a label to it. So selecting the L ID, and we're going to add whatever the value of I is to it. So that will give us unique IDs for each one of those. And so once we create the input, we're going to add this input to the span 1, or to the div 2. So we select div 2, and we're going to append the input to div 2. So that will be adding them to the div on the page. So let's see what that looks like and refresh it. Go out to the developer version, and we'll do a quick refresh and we'll see what we've got for content being output right now. And also check to see if we've got any errors. So we've got the radio buttons, we've got the questions, and we just need to apply some styling to these. So worst, and also now we can update and add best to it. And if we want to label the buttons, that's where we're going to create the labels now. So let's create a label object, and using the document create element, the element that we're creating is a label element. And for the label, let's set the attribute, and the attribute is 4 that we're setting, that's going to attach to the ID value of the element. So these will have unique ID values, because as the numbers increment, we get unique ID numbers. And the label text content that we're setting is going to be whatever the value of I is, so that each one of the radio buttons is going to get a label. And then using div2, let's append the label. So that way we've got labels after each one of the radio buttons. So let's see what that looks like. So that gives us all of the labels of the radio buttons. And you can click through them just to make sure that everything's working. And then just as we added in another span, after we run through and we generate the radio buttons, we'll do best, and this will be span 2, and we'll add in span 2. And actually I need to update this to be span 2 as well. So let's refresh. So now we've got the radio buttons, we've got labels, and we've got the questions here. So now it's just a matter of applying some styling to clean up the way that the code's being presented. And then we can add the functionality where we have the button to submit and get the results, to add the form to make the submission on that. So let's add in the submit button and update a function to handle the submit button. And then afterwards, we can set that up and add that to submit to the backend, to the Google script. So also this, let's make a quick update to it, and I'll turn these into divs. And you can keep them as list items, but this is just going to make it easier, so I don't have to spend as much time on focusing on cleaning up the styling. So this is just an easier way that I don't have to clean up the list items. And for each one of these, if we want to add in a class, so I can take that and do class list and add in, and I'll put a class of box, and then within the HTML you could also create a separate sheet for the styling, and I'm just going to add some padding around it, and we'll see what that looks like. And of course you can apply your own styling as needed. So that's just the way we can distinguish. And then also for the labels, let's add a little bit of styling. So I'll update the font size to be 0.7 EM so that's nice and small, and update the color of it so it doesn't stand out as much. And then also let's do some padding around it. And you can apply some styling as well to the other ones. So let's apply some more styling. And these are just for the guide words. And let's set the smaller font size for this as well. And then I'll apply this class to both of those guide words. And now let's take that class and we'll apply it to the span 1 and the span 2. So span 1. And you can use class list and add the class. And I'm also going to add that to span 2 as well. And I think that's probably going to be it for what I'm going to do with styling. And of course you can apply your own styling as needed. So this is just to kind of bring some distinction between these words and the actual question. So let's finalize this lesson by adding in a button. So this is going to be the button that gets clicked in order to output the content to submit the form. So but we do this with JavaScript as well. We'll create the submit button, and using the document create element, and the element that we're creating is going to be the button object. And this is going to be the actual submit button that's going to go within the form. So selecting the questions, and we'll add in, so 2 questions, we'll add in button. So the order does matter where we're placing it. So if we want to place it after the questions, we need to let the question loop run to construct that. And for the button, let's set some text content for the button. So text content, and we can just put submit quiz for the button. And let's also apply some attributes. So set attribute. So setting up this type as submit. So that will submit the content. And for the questions itself, now that we've added in a submit button, we could add the event listener. And what we're going to listen for is going to be the submit. And when it gets submitted, we'll submit the form object. So let's create that function that will handle the submit of the form. So that function should fire off whenever we submit the form. And we also want to prevent the default action. So selecting the event object, so running the prevent default, so that will actually prevent the default action of the form submission. So let's see what we've got now for the quiz questions. And we hit submit quiz, and these are all required, so they do need to get filled out. And there's our submit me firing off. And actually, while we're testing, I'm going to update the inputs, and I'm going to set the value of the input, or actually set the checked to be true as well. So that way when we load the form, we don't have to go through and check it while we're in testing mode. So it looks like we're ready to move on to the next lesson. So go ahead and generate the input form, and you'll be ready to move on to the next part of this next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to be focused on submitting the data from our quiz that we've just constructed and submitting it into the spreadsheet. So before we do that, let's do a quick update on the styling. So I want to update the style of the button to make it go all the way across. And we'll just do it as a display block and set the width to be 100%. And also for the display object, let's add in some padding and set up the border radius so it looks a little bit more like a button, so it's rounded borders. And also let's do the border of the to solid black. And of course you can apply whatever styling you feel necessary for your project. I just want to update the submit button so it looks a little bit bigger and it takes up some more space, and we can see it's still working, that we're able to submit the content. So let's go back into the code and focus on getting the submission of the data and sending that back over to the server side. Also, we might want to create another input, and that input can have the name value. So we are picking up for the sheet object, and this is just results, so rename it to results. So we do have a name value, and the date is going to automatically be populated with the script. So we've got the email, and also create one for the name, so the user can drop their name into the text field as well, and just give it a name of name and a name of name. So refresh, and so we should have an empty field here for your name, and actually need to update that to be your name. So we got the inputs there for the users. And then after that, then we generate the rest of the stuff. So going back into the script service where we've got the submit the form, and I'll move this up so it's easier to see on the screen. And also I'll make it slightly bigger as well for the coding. So now that we're preventing the default, we're logging into the console. Let's select and we'll create an object. And this is going to be our main response object. So we can drop all of our information into this as the response object. And using the response value of name. And this needs to correspond to our headers for the spreadsheet. And let's use the query selector, and we'll select the input with a name of whatever the one that is that we're trying to find to select. And let me just double check that to make sure that that's correct and set that up as a value. And in the email object, we're going to add whatever the email address is. And for here, I'll set up a default value for the name so we don't have to populate it. And then this can be removed when we go live with the form. So let's see what happens. So refresh the page and let's submit the content. So everything should be populated. Let's clear. And within the submit, what I want to do is before we conclude this function, let's output the value of res. So this is what we're actually going to be sending back to the server. So refresh again because we made updates to the client side. And clear the console and submit. So we're picking up those two fields, and they're actually going to correspond with the fields that we have. We want to also select all of the checked inputs. So let's do a selection using the questions. So that's the question object that we have here, the questions object. And then query selector. And this time we're going to use query selector all to select all of the questions that have an input that are checked. And we can console log the results of vals. So this should select all of the elements that have inputs. So another refresh and clear the console and then hit submit. So we create a node list of all of the elements. So that means that we can loop through that node list and use for each to loop through each one of those inputs. And just give it a name of I. And also we're going to track its index value as well, in case we need to make use of that. So as we loop through, let's take the response object and select the name of the element. So whatever the current name is of this element. And that should actually correspond to the headers, as that's how we've generated it. And select a value for the number of the input. So let's see what that looks like. And do a refresh. So we're building the response object that we're going to send to the backend. So A1 is 1, A1, A2, and so on. So if you update these, it will update those values corresponding to whatever the questions were. And these are only sorted in order, so they're not the order that they're presented. They're in alphabetical order as objects get displayed. So if you're looking at this and thinking, okay, 5, 5, but this one's not 4. So if I move these, it doesn't necessarily represent that where they're in that same order. And sometimes they might be, sometimes they're not. So it looks like A2 is the first question, A1 is the second question, and so on. And this is the information that we want to send back to the server side. So once we've constructed the object data that we want to send to the server side, we're ready to use the Google script run service, and we'll add with success handler, and we'll run a function called onSuccess and create a function that says add to sheet, and it's going to pick up that response object that we're sending. So let's add and update a function on success, and this will handle the return value, so whatever the return value is from the server, from the add sheet function. Let's go back to the Google script and create the add to sheet function. So this way we can handle content that's coming in. So this is going to be having data that's loaded, and then we can also just return the data for now. So let it do a round trip just to make sure that it's working. And then on the server side, what we'll do is we can sift through this data and we can populate the content into the spreadsheet. So that's coming up in the next lesson, where we're going to be taking the data. And right now, what we're doing is we're taking data from the client side, we're taking content from the server side, constructing our quiz corresponding to what we've got within the questions area. And then on the client side, we're sending the data back to the server side with the updated response that we have within the quiz results. And that way we can take that information and we can populate it into the spreadsheet. So that's coming up next. This lesson, we're going to be wrapping up adding the input values from the web app and adding them and appending them into the sheet. So going into the sheet itself, we have a listing of questions. These question IDs correspond with the ID values, with the header values we have within the sheet. And then we've also populated it with a few other field names. And these field names are also ones that we're going to pick up and we're using on the client side, so within the web application. And then we're going to use those to have the data go into the right columns within the spreadsheet. So going into the quiz, we generate the quiz from the question object that is coming from the server side. And then when we submit the quiz, right now what's happening is that we're constructing the object that we're submitting, and then we're actually just returning that same object back. And in this lesson, we're going to be adding it and appending the content into the sheets so that we can populate the content into the sheets. So let's go ahead and we're going to select the sheet object and select the right sheet that we want to use. So I'm going to copy the ID of the sheet that we had from before, and we'll get the sheet by name. And this time, the sheet that we're populating into is results. So dropping it into the results. And I'll make this a little bit smaller so that it's a little bit easier to see. And we're using data again, so we don't want to use data again. I'll just call it vals. And then data is actually, let's update this to be the sheet object. And for right now, what we'll do is we'll return back the vals, and we'll construct some other object to return back to the client side, including getting the row of the sheet that we've attached. So now that we're creating and getting the results, let's use for to check if X, and we should select the headings from the data object. So let's get all of the, we'll get all of the headings, and then we'll check to see which headings are matching. So from the sheet, get values, and we need to get the range first from, let's get the data range, so getting all of the content, and then get values. So that way we've got all of the values, and we only want the first set of values, so that's within the headings. So we'll return back the first array within the multi-dimensional array, so it's going to output all of the headings. And we can actually return this back as an object. And then console log out, and we'll have another one called headings, and that will hold the headings information. So let's loop through this object and check for the corresponding value in headings. And if we do find the corresponding value, then we're going to add that value into the headings, into the row. So we need to create an array that we can use to eventually append into the active sheet. And then let's take the sheet and we're going to append a row and using the holder array as our row object to append. So that means that we want to loop through all of the headings and check to see if we've got corresponding data. So let's set up output, and this will use a ternary operator to see if we've got headings value for X and see if that exists within the vals object that we just got sent to us. And if it does, then we use the vals with the corresponding heading X value to return back the value object. Otherwise, we'll just leave it at blank. And then let's take holder and we'll append to that holder the content of output. And I think we're ready to try it. So let's do a refresh. And we can clear that and do a submit. And there's our listing of headings. That's our object that got passed in. And now if we go over to here, we see that we've populated the data within the sheet. And as we're looping through, let's do a quick check. So as we're updating the output that we're appending to the sheet, we want to check to see if, and this is the heading at the time, so whatever the heading value is. So as we're iterating through all of the headings, we're going to check to see if it's equal to date. And if it is, then we'll populate date. So we'll take output and we'll add the date object into the output. So let's try this one more time. We don't have to refresh. We haven't changed anything. And so do you like Gmail is 5? Do you like scripts 5? Docs is 5. And let's see what we've got here. So A2, A3, and A5 are all 5. If we go back to questions, Docs, Gmail, and A3, the scripts, are all 5s. And that corresponds to the data. And we also, within the results, we got the date object submitted. So that's how you can submit your quiz content. And also, since we've submitted and appended to the row, we can get a value for last row. So taking the sheet object, get last row, and we can append that into the object. So return back the value of where we've submitted it. So let's submit it. And now we're getting return back row 4, and that's going to correspond to the sheet object value where we've submitted it. And then that way, on the client side, whenever that gets submitted, now we're running the on success. And here we can say that thank you for submitting your results. And we can clear out the questions from the question area or from the whole form. We can just clear out all of the questions because once it's submitted, we don't need to run through that again. We can loop through the response data if we want. So that's another option that we have. And in this case, what we'll do is we're going to take questions and update the inner HTML to say, thank you for submitting your results. And we can also get the row value that's coming back within the E object. And let's use the backticks. And then whatever the row value is, so E row is wherever the results are in. So let's do a refresh because we updated the client side. And let's submit the form object. And once we get our result, we say thank you for submitting your results. Your results are in row 5. And also just to make sure that the user can't resubmit the button, let's update the button and we're going to set it to disabled. so that the user can't press the button multiple times. So take the button object, disabled, and set that to true, and then button also style background color, and set that to be red, and button text content, so the user knows that the content's been submitted while we're waiting for the data to be sent back to the server side. So let's see what happens. So we get saving, and then we get thank you for submitting your results there in row 6. Let's do a few styling updates to these input fields, make them a little bit wider, and also we'll center the content in those fields. So that's already sitting within here. So we can add in some classes, and I'll just call it user info. And within the styling, let's update some of those properties there. So for the user info class, we'll set the width to be 100% and text align to center. And see what that looks like. So it looks a little bit better. And then we'll also change the width of the inputs. And also let's take the inputs that are within the user info and set the width to 70%. And refresh. So that should hopefully make it a little bit larger for the inputs. And of course you can apply styling as needed. So there we go. So now we've got our completed form. Also, let's maybe do a background. And the background, I just set a black background. And once you're done testing, then we're just going to update as we're constructing the inputs. So we don't need to have it checked. If you do want them required, keep the required to true. And let's refresh one more time. And I'm also going to do a little bit more styling for the question. Let's set the font size. And let's add this class to the questions. So where we're creating and constructing the questions, and that's div1. And with class list, this is just JavaScript. You can add whatever classes you want. If you want to set multiple classes, you can set it as an attribute class. This is just to add some additional styling to the questions. So you're welcome to customize it as you want. And the benefit of doing it this way, where you're creating a web app that's generating the quiz questions, is that if you use the Google Forms, it uses the input names as the headers. So sometimes they're rather long. And if you want to produce a neater report and also some more flexibility on the content that's being output, you can use the spreadsheets and the web app with Google Scripts. And now if you update any of these questions, or if you add to those questions, they're going to also be implemented within the quiz dynamically. So now we've got all of those new questions are present. And then you just need to update the result area using the IDs that are associated with the question names. So that provides you more flexibility as you're constructing questions and also tracking the information back into your spreadsheet.